I'm really delighted that we've been able to organize a wonderful monthly research talk and by Austin Wade Smith. I'm saying your full name here. I hope it doesn't sound like, your mother's mad at you or something like that. Austin goes by they, them, and is an artist, ecologist, writer, technologist, and is based in Brooklyn, New York. They are the executive director of the Regen Foundation, a nonprofit researching sovereign regenerative economies. Their research explores the interrelation of mutualism, animism, and bioregionalism in decentralized technical and economic infrastructures. Previously, they taught critical methodologies on climate justice in art and engineering at universities in New York, and they enjoy cultivating orchids and flying kites and Tai Chi, I think, too.
Yeah,
So, without further ado, thank you for joining us. I'm turning it over to you now.
sure. Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to be here, happy that it's recorded. And this is an opportunity for me to interface with this community in a more direct way. I've been working with Trin on some of her research and as well as working with James in a more professional capacity. And so this is kind of an opportunity to more directly sort of present some of the work that might be already in orbit in your all's ecosystem through Trin's work and others, and just sort of the general exposure of sort of the regenerative side of blockchain, which is broadly speaking what I'm going to be talking about. It's an area that I have some level of expertise in, and yeah, so I'm happy to be here. I think I'll just start screen sharing and we'll just jump into it. I have more than enough content, so I'm going to try to improv this a little bit just to see how timing goes and things like that. I don't want to like deluge or data dump. I'd rather have it be a bit more spacious so there can be conversation if there wants to be. But yeah, let's get going. Can you all see the screen share? Great. Okay. Well, let's begin. Yeah. Hi, my name is Austin Wade Smith. I often go by AWS, in part because I like getting confused with Amazon Web Service. Um, I'm the executive director at the Regen Foundation, and I run another project called River Computer. Um, to give some context, let me move this window out of the way. To give some context for what I do at the Regen Foundation, at the Regen Foundation, we're a US-based 501c3 that catalyzes grassroots institutions that are in service to ecosystem regeneration and resilience. And for the last 4 years, roughly, we've been exploring what's the role of digital public infrastructure in supporting community-led governance, ownership, and sensing protocols, primarily in relation to this lineage of what we call the commons or commoning. I'm going to talk a lot about commons and commoning on decentralized protocols today. Um, another way Another way to describe what I do in my professional capacity is we explore how we can leverage decentralized protocols like blockchains, and all the applications that can run on top of them in order to promote a more pluralist and interdependent future. And so it's not just blockchains that I spend a lot of time working and prototyping within, but more broadly, how can they be in service and strengthen other parallel movements that are happening in ecocentric law and economics? So regenerative, like Earth law and regenerative economics could be sort of two canons that we could point to there. Um, so I'm not really going to give a broad presentation on Regen Network, but I could. So I'll be kind of concise. I want to focus more on the research intentions within my work, and I'd like to have the goal of this presentation be to, in a way, like point at a number of different research threads that I think are underdeveloped and underexplored, but are incredibly important towards developing viable economic models that are in service to like right relation to the Earth, to align planetary health and human health as one and the same. Um, so rather than give a full presentation on Regen Network, I'll say that Regen Foundation, where I work, is the nonprofit arm of a larger project called the Regen Network. We're an application-specific blockchain that's been designed and structured to be a ledger of like human environmental stewardship. You can think of it as a blockchain that's specifically dedicated to like tracking and monitoring the pulse of the planet and how people steward it. And we've been doing that since 2017. As an application-specific blockchain, our validator set is bioregionally based and is like mission aligned. So we're not just like an L2 sitting on top of a larger sort of more neutral infrastructure. The validator set that maintains our delegated proof of stake blockchain is bioregionally anchored, and we work all over the world. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the kind of theoretical implications, but there's an entire set of like collaborations and partnerships and people and places that underpin this work. So I'm happy to give broader context as people are interested. Um, because we've been working in the space for a while, we've written a fair amount and done a lot of sort of like primary research, like developing ideas from first principles about the relationships of blockchains to human environmental flourishing. And I'll talk about some of that here, but if you're curious to know like the broader body of work, you can scan the QR code and visit our website. You can just type it into the URL. It's regen.foundation. So regen.foundation, www.regen.foundation. And just some examples of a number of like written works that are on there that explore the relationship of DAOs and blockchains to bioregionalism and other contexts. So I'll talk some about that, but if you're interested, you can find more there. Um, so yeah, I'm gonna kind of talk about three things today, but they fit into two broader categories, and um, they're a way of mapping the sort of for-profit, nonprofit arm of the Regen Network. And so um, I would say that the Regen Foundation builds ecological institutions where we're invested in using this new sector and this emerging tech stack to be in service to creating new kinds of institutions that catalyze like a regenerative transition into a post-extractive economy. And what kinds of institutions are they? How are they composed? Are they physical? Are they digital? How are they programmed? How do they work? Is sort of the area of focus that I spend a lot of time in, and a lot of my colleagues as well. And uh, because we're rooted in a sort of economic approach, a regenerative economic approach, my colleagues in the for-profit side developed like a registry and a system of developing methodologies for forming discrete forms of value, units of value that we refer to as eco credits. And I'll unpack what that means and the value of even using the term credit at all. There's a lot there, but suffice to say that we're working in the space of, well, what new kinds of value might be created to catalyze this regenerative transition? How do we back our value and who decides what it's comprised of? So some interesting questions there. So you can think of this as like a kind of institutional question and a crediting question. And I'll talk about both of those today, but I'm going to split the institution into two sort of separate threads. One of them relates to uh, the collection of entities or actors of individuals that form an institution, and the second dimension is the contracts, codes, and commitments that orchestrate them. So I could define an institution from this sense as a body of actors, both are human and non-human even, that are arranged together by the commitments, codes, and contracts they create. And in that way, an institution can live beyond any one of its individual members because there's the arrangement of how these actors organize and mobilize resources and make decisions is held in different kinds of codes and contracts that outlive any one individual. And that's kind of what makes an institution. That's a theory I'm putting forward. And the other part of it to sort of distill is like a credit, what the notion of a kind of theory of value is that a credit is effectively a collection of claims about ecological state and and the sort of the nature of the interventions which have been undertaken that alter that state. So I'm going to talk primarily about these three elements, the sort of actors, humans and non-human subjects, which can create a new kind of category of institutions, the contracts that are effectively the codes which structure the interactions within and outside those institutions, as well as this notion of claims, which allow us to structure and create systems of value which circulate between those different institutions. And all of this is enabled in a meaningful way through the opportunities made possible with distributed ledger technology, DLTs or blockchains, if you like to call, whatever you want to call them. So let's start with the first one, and just do sort of like a primer on some of like the regenerative institutions that have been in existence for some time. Um, we've inherited a, a kind of schism through the modernist like edict that human world and the nature or the living world are separate. And we could say that we've never been modern, but the tension between the social and the natural is oftentimes mediated through the institutions we create, which kind of keep the score. And so I'm going to put forward that institutions are a way of like modulating the relationship between the social and the natural. Um, and that maybe more specifically, what we're seeing, we're certainly seeing this in terms of the popularity of nonprofits, activist groups, new kinds of funding structures, financing facilities that are structuring institutions that are more bioregionally anchored. So the institutions themselves are not just simply purely like mission or value aligned, but are actually based around a particular territory or the contours of the Earth itself. So bioregional organizations and bioregional institutions is like a very big area of work that's happening right now. And the Regen Foundation has been focusing a lot on how distributed technologies and blockchains can be in service to those. And I'm going to basically be talking about a lot of those today. And I want to put forward that that one of the core social institutions that we don't talk about enough related to this kind of system are called commons. And commons are not the state and they're not the market. They're a third way. Prior to the enclosure movement and the mass proliferation of private property, commons were very prevalent. And the commons theorist David Boullier divides them into like three core components, that there's a common resource, whether that's uh, a biological resource like fish or water from an aquifer or grains or something like that. There's a set of protocols or rules around access and use. So not that you cannot exhaust or overuse them. And there's terms and rules around how people do that. And then there's some system of information exchange, which allows people to keep state and um, be able to like understand what's currently happening and have information flow fluidly. So we typically think about commons in this sort of historic mode, like parks or commons or the Boston Commons or something like that. But with the prevalence of digital technology, we've seen this mass proliferation of new kinds of commons that um, are as they're native to the digital world. And you could think of Wikipedia or Knowledge Commons as forms of those. And so I think it's really interesting to think about as as webs of life and relationships that are native to the biophysical earth, the biosphere, are undergoing this big collapse, this sort of crisis. We're seeing a biodiversity collapse. Simultaneously, we're seeing this huge proliferation in the commons that are native to digital spaces. So I'm very interested in how digital commons and biophysical commons can be mutually reinforcing to one another. And I think we're about to hit a renaissance where we realize that we can use digital commoning tools as a way to help be better stewards of the living world or the biophysical commons. I'll skip over this for now and say that actually what we're looking at is a sort of hybrid state where we're creating digital commons that both contain records, data, information, media of some kind, and they also can contain individuals who are participating. They might be individuals like human beings that can have agency and voluntarily communicate, or we might be creating commons that reflect, intersubjective experiences. So the non-human world or even resources themselves. the new paradigm of sort of like hybrid living in digital commons begins to problematize what's the resource and what's the subject. And I've been thinking about this for quite some time, that maybe I've been working on this thread that we're under a larger transition from thinking about the world in an object resource form to exploring how we can understand the broader set of stakeholders to be like subjects, which could be something that's been situated through legacies of indigenous law and cosmology, as well as through like the rights of nature movement and legal personhood. Um, and transitioning not just from objects to resources through subjects to creating new kinds of institutions that are populated with humans and non-human subjects. And it turns out that like the digital addressing systems enabled through blockchains can really help with that. Okay, so let's like root some of these ideas around these new kinds of institutions and the types of commenting that I introduced through some like more concrete mediums. Like how are these maintained and expressed? And I'm going to use the working title contracts to begin introducing that. If I were to sort of revisit the same introduction from a slightly different angle, I might say that the ecological crisis is requiring us to redefine the boundaries of social life, um, and that what the social is a reflection of where we choose to draw the line of who and is not included um, in our definition of social life. And that seems to be so clearly demarcated, but it's not clearly demarcated at all. The social world is actively constructed and contested all the time, and it's produced through different systems of addressing that allow different subjects to be accessed. We could talk about the way the social world is addressed through economic terms, like the ability to hold a fund or a treasury, like who gets to have a bank account. We could talk about it from a legal perspective, like what entity gets to hold rights. We could talk about it from a technical perspective, like I have a username, passwords, authentication, things like that. And so we're in this renaissance now of redefining what's actually included in social life. And if we take seriously this idea that the human and nature are not separate entities, then it totally problematizes this idea of like what the social is. It's not such a steady container anymore. Um, and so I think in the process of rediscovering the basis of social life and what it means to be a social species in a way, we're rediscovering a kind of core set of principles that make us people or that define our relationship to the planet. So um, I might call this like an eco-social contract is something we're rediscovering, which is a spoof on the notion of a social contract. And if I were to try to give some detail to what this contract looks like, I could say it's essentially the core tenet of reciprocity. I could call it right relation. I think it's the essential concept of regeneration as well, which holds that there's an actor, an individual like myself, and in my actions through stewardship, I might support and give care and nurture the world that I call home. And in kind, that world is ever more capable of sustaining and supporting me. So it's a story of like mutual capacitance. There is an interesting quirk in English, or maybe it's not a quirk, it's actually pretty revealing that to incapacitate something is an easy word to reach for, but to capacitate something or to co-capacitate, to mutually bring capacity, there isn't a good word for that. And I think that's the basic tenet of what we would call regeneration, that you show up and are in service to a system in such a way that that system can better support and sustain you. And if I were to drill down into some more penetrating language, I might call that a kind of covenant that people hold between ourselves and the world around us. And that word covenant is charged on purpose, but I think there's an essential way that we can begin to discover how is that covenant expressed in our institutions and how is it expressed through these new definitions of the social. So we tend to think about this idea of regeneration or reciprocity, this covenant, as something which is intrinsic to a person, and it certainly points towards more kind of like spiritual or energetic dimensions around something that's intrinsically held by an individual, but I'm quite interested in how we encode this covenant, this contract of like reciprocity into the different social and technical systems that we create. So we have potentially the opportunity to embed this contract into the socio-technical systems that make up our world, that we can write this contract into the infrastructure which drives our world. And three big sort of categories that define our sort of social technical life could be the economy. So in this example, it's like a spreadsheet that's looking at ecosystem services or nature-based solutions, which is a contentious space and therefore interesting to talk about. We might say that we could describe it in terms of like computer code, like it can be expressed in computer syntax. I could write a class around the idea that there's sort of equations or functions that reflect the sort of co-capacitance between people and the environment. I could also encode that covenant or that contract in legal terms, where there's a series of whereas and therefores. And I think what I want to kind of point to is the fact that all of these are a kind of code that's being expressed through different medium or are legible to different kinds of systems, but at the root share a common principle. So how are we embedding values of regeneration into contracts or codes that are legible to different systems that drive and define our world? Um, and so these institutions that I kind of brought up, the commons, are in a way the sort of containers that hold these different codes and contracts, and they intermediate, they relate, they interrelate our interactions between people and the planet. Um, and potentially blockchains can be really interesting ways of embedding this value and this ethic into our institutional design. So at the Regen Foundation, we begin this process of exploring its application like any movement does, which is gathering together either through Zoom or in context to explore ways in which people and the environment can be in better relation to one another. You could call this like environmental stewardship or like programs for people to be better Earth guardians. We have scenarios where small groups of like local communities or indigenous populations are protecting large swaths of biodiversity, primary forest or old growth. We could have a scenario where you have a farmer cooperative in Cambodia that's looking to transition towards more regenerative practices to support the native pollinator population there, which is on the brink of collapse. We can think about that in the context of like savings cooperatives, informal savings cooperatives in East Africa, or around the idea of creating some kind of like new unit of value that prioritizes protecting and conserving the Amazon. So I want to start by saying that this notion of a covenant and this kind of idea of a contract, it doesn't have to just like, it doesn't begin with some machine readable form or a spreadsheet or like legalese. It begins with people creating a kind of container to discover what type of partnership and sort of stewardship model they want to develop. Because all over the world, people are pretty clearly seeing there's an urgent need for developing those. And in a way, these covenants are kind of like containers that allow a discovery to happen. Like we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but we were here to find out. Um, and maybe the next step from gathering is creating some kind of formalization. And you could say, okay, this is beginning to look like legalese or like legally legible language. It's non-binding. It's written in a sort of established structure of principles and terms and things like that. But this is an MOU that the Regen Foundation has developed in partnership with Maori, like a Maori community in the Northland of Aotearoa, aka New Zealand, and it's effectively inviting a discussion between a sovereign indigenous group and an organization, a nonprofit organization that like mine, and saying, well, how can we explore how Web3, new forms of law, new kinds of economics can be in service to um, uh, indigenous sovereignty, or what's called Maori Wairua. Um, so interestingly, in the context of Northland of Aotearoa, a Maori word is called like a waka, which is like a canoe. That's like what it means. And so we refer to these like covenants, or what I call living treaties, as waka. They're like vessels or containers that allow the potential for collaboration and partnership to happen. And maybe kind of at the root of what I'm implying so far, but haven't said clearly, is that if there's a level of sovereignty that blockchains enable for co-determination and independence for groups of people to make decisions and cooperate together as per the kind of lineage of commoning, um, there are many existing nations on Earth that have been working for their tribal sovereignty to be recognized and respected for a long time. Um, and there's a clear uh, overlap and potential instrumentalization that like blockchain technology that enables sovereign decision making to be in service to, say, sovereign indigenous nations. And that is a really active area of experimentation and discussion, and that it should be done like quite carefully. Um, so that has got me into the space of what I'm referring to as like living treaties, which is a continuation of this idea of a contract or a covenant. And you can think of living treaties as these as open containers for people to enter into that allow them to be compensated or supported for practicing and maintaining stewardship or guardianship. Um, and the you could think of it like if I commit to planting X number of mangroves and I can verify that I've done that, then I'm compensated for that work. If I engage in surface rehydration efforts in the panhandle of Texas to replenish an aquifer and I can demonstrate that, then I'm able to be compensated for that. And in effect, we're using smart contracts, or like autonomously running contracts embedded in code, to help put pressure on certain patterns of right relation to be upheld. Um, and so the anatomy of a living treaty could be, okay, we make a contract or a commitment to replenish an aquifer, to protect a keystone species in South America, to conserve and protect a fishery that's been you know overfished to the point of extinction or collapse, to protect old growth forests, etc. We make a commitment, and that's a kind of discrete form of a contract. We are able to embed that commitment onto a digital ledger, which allows it to basically run. It doesn't turn off. It's continuously operating. And in that way, people who choose to can basically apply to that contract to demonstrate that stewardship has been undertaken and they're compensated for it. I call that like a living treaty. And I think that this is a kind of institution, although at a certain point, it's really just like the minimum viable version of an institution. Um, we're able to embed a kind of ethic into a self-executing contract that doesn't turn off and can't be debanked and it can't be taken offline, but allows us to create incentives to recenter the sort of this core eco-social contract, this core covenant. And and this is where it gets, a little bit wacky, but still entirely serious, is that through the rights of nature movement, we've established the legal precedent that non-human entities can have legal standing and have personhood. If a corporation can be a person, why can't a forest be a person? But we've never had a way to be able to actually embed like funds or operating agreements or anything within non-human entities. But digital addressing systems enabled through blockchains allow us to do that. So imagine there's a tree that's an old growth tree or a precious like patch of forest. As an ecosystem. It has legal standing, which is like a legal wrapper that gives it personhood. But through blockchains, we can say, okay, it might have an inventory, a pool that it pulls from. It's literally able to own funds or currency. It could have some level of sensory input, and I'll talk about claims in just a second here. Like it's a way to like you can submit information to them, and maybe it has contracts that make decisions to allocate funds based off of the input it's receiving. And the living world itself, the more than human world itself, is actually legally containing these living treaties, these living covenants. Um, and that's might sound absurd, and if it does, then I think you're grokking what I'm getting at, because it isn't any more absurd, I don't think, than these incredibly complex abstractions that we might call like a joint stock company or like an LLC. We've already done the sort of mental gymnastics to create these entities. Why not leverage them in service to a better planet? And it turns out that decentralized storage on blockchains, identity systems, and the ability to make self-executing contracts through blockchains make that more possible. I think this is going to be a renaissance in the way we think about new kinds of institutional design and the contracts that underpin them. So I won't spend too much time on this, but we could say here's an ecosystem itself on the far right, and I'm now taking that eco-social contract, that co-capacitance design that I showed in the beginning of the presentation, and I'm adding like digital interiority to it, that this ecosystem or this individual actor could hold data or contracts and deeds or currency, and that based off of certain proof in the form of claims, they're able to be supported for that. And this is an area of potential, an elegant form of like automation could be entered into this, or it could be highly manual and governed by people or some interaction between the two. And I refer to these as ecological institutions. And this sort of contract work is a sort of subset of that. And we're actually prototyping these with different organizations, grassroots organizations all over the planet. So this is not, we're not specifically working with Mount Taranaki, but it's a very clear example of the idea. Mount Taranaki is a is a taonga. It's like a precious cultural lineage within the Northland of New Zealand, in Aotearoa. It has legal standing, it has personhood. What would it mean for Mount Taranaki to legally hold the contracts that would support individuals who are protecting its rights in Parliament or were making active effort to preserve its cultural heritage? So there's a number of contexts where I'm implementing this project, or I'm co-implementing it with others. I think we're in a phase right now where not all of the details have to be worked out. Rather, if we can captivate the imagination and symbolically demonstrate that using some of this new technology and some of the mental gymnastics we've already done with the design of companies and limited liability entities, that we can begin to explore new patterns of agency for the more than human world that might be in service to human environmental flourishing as a way of resisting this meta crisis or polycrisis, however you want to call it. Interestingly, this emoji is not often used. It's the witness emoji. So it's like a speech bubble with an I in it. And I think that's kind of a really elegant way of describing what these things are doing. They're both witnessing and observing and also able to act. And that sort of like welding of sensing and action together is a unique property that blockchain technology can enable. So maybe to kind of land this in the third category, I've talked about the sort of the bodies, the corpuses, the sort of earth native institutions, and how they might be constructed. And I've also talked about some of the lineage of commoning about around where we might borrow from and what we might build from in order to do that. And I've talked a bit about this notion of like a covenant or a contract and how we can embed that into legal, economic, and technical means, and then create these sort of, kind of wild creatures that are in some way autonomous. Effectively, I'm talking about decentralized autonomous organizations, but of a very particular flavor. But then the question becomes, okay, well, what actually drives these things? How can you ensure integrity of input of information? And this is like the last area of focus that I'm going to talk about today. It's called claims, and it's a very big area. And I'll start with the proposition that people might say that we live in a data economy or a data-driven economy. Data runs our world, and I think that's true to an extent, but I would actually amend that to say that claims run the world. It's not just data. Data doesn't have any real specification around its integrity. Data could be garbage, it could be good. As soon as we verify and validate data, it becomes a claim that's actually actionable and instrumental. So the question becomes, who gets to verify and validate data and make it a claim? And that's what I'm going to talk about now. Um, and in order to get there, I'm gonna take a sort of another view of what I've just said through an economic or like value theory of value perspective. And in the spirit of talking about the covenants and how we embed them into socio-technical systems, I would argue that we embed this covenant into our expressions of value, and how we define value says everything about what we hold to be important. Like, what do we pin our value to? Um, we've lost the gold standard. You could say the value of the US dollar is backed by sovereign force or petrodollars. What is it? It's a compelling question, and it turns out that the nature of distributed ledgers allow us to design currencies, and there's been this big explosion in currencies, a lot of which are junk. But that doesn't mean there can't be meaningful currency design that's enabled. So I work a lot in the category of what are called credits. And you could think of credits in as a sort of like a container, a holder of value. But what defines that value is an open-ended conversation. That's actually a matter of governance or a collective decision. So carbon credit could just be solely based off of the amount of tons of carbon sequestered into the ground. And maybe that's at the expense of actually improving the biosphere. It becomes a metric that's only solved for that undermines all these other metrics. We've been working at the Regen Network for some time about developing eco credits, which take a much more holistic or plural set of inputs as a way of defining human environmental health. And what would those look like if they were used as units of value, discrete systems of value? Um, and this is an example of an eco credit that we have been co-developing with the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative in the Upper Amazon, where the credit is defined by a proof of jaguar, which is a keystone species, and it's meant to be an indicator of a whole slew of other human environmental parameters. So if you're looking for an indice, that's a good indicator of human environmental well-being. The prevalence of a keystone species is a good indicator. And that can be bounded into some asset form. But what's inside that credit is in fact a sort of list of claims, a list of structured claims that say this creature was here at this time, or this is the view of the edge of deforestation, and yes or no, the line has or has not been crossed of deforestation, bioacoustical data, as well as you know tracking in all its various forms like lat long and geospatial coordinates and things like that. So the credit is a kind of interesting form, and I have problems with it. I have some trepidations with it, I would say, because I think it lends itself to being like very discrete. And we overemphasize the discreteness of the credit form of value, or what I would call like a nominal form of value. And the reason it's discrete and bounded is because we kind of like cut it out of its context, and therefore it's fungible. It's equivalent. It can move around. Um, and one of the core premises of regenerative economics is to argue, well, can we come up with a theory of value between the human and the more than human world that argues that it holds value precisely because it maintains its context, it's situated in a particular way? Can there be such a thing as value that isn't based off of commodification or the commodity fetish? And I don't know what you would call that. Maybe you'd call that an anti-commodity. And so this idea of crediting and claims is within this larger space of trying to define value systems that are not based off of commodification. And if people have issues with some aspects of new theories of economics related to ecology, they might argue it's just the commodification of the world. It's an on-ramp to just commodifying everything. And I think that is an understandable frustration, but it just presumes that the only way something can have value is if it's in a commodity, and we're trying to ask, is that possible to be a more relational system of value? So we currently hold value in lots of different ways, and several of the ones up here are like more blockchain native versions. We call them eco credits. You could say that there's like NFTs or NF trees. And there's lots of ways that people intervene and demonstrate their environmental protection. Um, but what I want to argue is that all of those are in fact just bundles of claims. So any kind of like organic certification, an impact certification, an NFT, a reporting for a grant that you're, ensuring that your grant was used in compliance with how it was granted, all of those are effectively claims. And what we're looking at currently is a landscape where we're bundling claims into different kinds of nominal, like asset or relational forms, in order to satisfy different contracts. Claims and contracts kind of run the world in one view. And so we use claims as a sort of like elemental data type on our blockchain to begin to describe human environmental interaction. And so you could say there's data, like some kind of evidence that something's happened. But in order for that to become a claim, it must be verified and validated. And that is a huge area of potential that I think is under recognized or under realized, in part because it's very difficult to do. So one of the questions is, can we use distributed ledgers and blockchains to make more distributed and decentralized the process of validating and verifying data so that it's actionable and instrumental to do different things like satisfy contracts, create assets, make impact certificates, etc. And I'll just skip this ahead. And so I'm going to prompt with a question that to date, the validation and verification industry is incentivized to be opaque, centralized, and highly expensive. It's a sort of expert system that knows better. So the value for regenerative stewardship in, say, the global south or in the global majority is verified through an agency that are experts. They're typically highly expensive. You don't know how they're verifying it. And once they get a stamp of approval, then that data becomes a claim that can underpin a system of value. It can inform policy decisions, etc. And so I think there's this core tension that occurs there when we verify data by an outside party. It has the pattern of alienating the individuals who are responsible for doing the nature positive or regenerative work. It alienates them, and yet if the people doing the work, the argument might be that they're not neutral or independent. So how do we balance this alienation versus enfranchisement that happens with verification in order to make a claim? And the claims are sort of like what moves around and zooms around in order to satisfy and to fulfill these different contracts and covenants that we've structured. Um, so I spent a lot of time developing and working with with partnerships on the ground and with other sort of engineers and legal experts and economic experts on like what is the potential for blockchains to be able to create new systems of verification and validation that enfranchise local communities. And maybe there's a spectrum that we need to calibrate the weight and the burden of verification appropriately with the claim we're trying to make. So if it's an incredibly pivotal claim that has a lot of resources riding on it, then it should invite some level of like third party engagement. But there's many different kinds of like claims that can be more internally verified. And using some incentive design, some incentive mechanics through governance on blockchains, we might open up a space where local groups can verify and validate their data with a higher level of integrity. And that could move from just neutrally anchoring data onto a chain to having an incremental set of validators participating in it, to having validators who put bonded stake down. They put stake to verify their claim, to what are called like participatory guarantee systems that might use peer validation with some level of subject matter experts, all the way up to like formalized validation and verification bodies. Um, Basically, the underlying premise of consensus engines within within blockchains is that you use financial risk to validate a collectively held truth. It's expensive to lie, and proof of stake consensus works in that very way, and many oracles work that way. And so one way of describing this idea of the claims is that I'm introducing oracles. It can be done in maybe just a second here. So there's like a wide range of how we might describe this: participatory audits, collateralized or bonded anchoring, incremental, all the way up to like verification bodies. And this is like this is an interesting overlap between like sensing systems and governance systems. Governance doesn't seem like quite like the right word, and it's not purely scientific either. So who gets to validate and verify the claims that are driving these different contracts and covenants? That is like a really big space of question. And then it invites the idea of like, okay, well, if we were to create new kinds of value, how might they be comprised of different kinds of claims that were themselves validated according to the different tiers and systems that I showed previously? So if we were to make some kind of eco credit, it might be a bundle of claims effectively. It's an aggregation, and some of them might be ecological in nature around preventing deforestation or the prevalence of a keystone species. Some of them might be cultural in nature, and you could say that the preservation of a language or a school is built in a particular region. And that might be like a biocultural system of value called a biocultural credit, a biocultural unit. How do we design what is comprised in those biocultural units? Is this a viable system of value that could circulate in a broader sense? There's a lot of work around philanthropic instruments and the space of nonprofits and things like that, which are basically defined by how effectively are they relieving sustainable development goals, achieving sustainable development goals. So there's SDG 4, 6, or 12, and you can make individual claims around those different SDGs in discrete claim chunks and bundle those together to qualify for nonprofit status, or to say that the loan should be forgiven, or to basically be legible towards this much broader set of policy uh, efforts that relate to sustainability. So this isn't really a credit form so much as it is bundling impact claims as a form of like impact accounting. Um, and it goes further into maybe like a space of like liability or insurance, where you could say, well, we could have a kind of parametric insurance model, which is yet another way of describing a contract, where, say, in Southern California, if a community of homeowners is able to demonstrate they've done fire risk mitigation, they would pay lower premiums on their insurance. And I'm working actively in developing and better understanding parametric insurance models and how that might be a really powerful road to follow in deploying um, regenerative economic principles. So a credit is this kind of like indices of flourishing um, that are comprised of claims, and the claims can be structured through different means. And maybe one of the most powerful things that blockchains can enable us to do is to um, uh, collectively govern what are the indices that we're measured by. GDP is wrought with assumptions. And it's not like people casually use GDP. It's a system of national accounting, but we're using indices and measures all the time to describe how well we're doing. We have KPIs and all the different acronyms that might describe like the ways that we measure ourselves. And I think that we have the opportunity to govern and create new systems that where communities more on a more active and local level are able to govern and define what their indices look like. And that's maybe one way of describing what a credit is, what the future of crediting is. So I know I said a lot of things, and I kind of just am okay with that. This is a recording that people can pause and rewind and go forward if they want to. But I'll leave with like a few prompts that I think are sort of polemics or um, flags to plant in the sand a bit that help people position and get form their own opinion about what this. So I think that in order to like really transition to a regenerative paradigm and compost this extractive one that we're within, we have to support the creation of these social bodies, this these institutions that underpin project development, planning, and implementation of protecting the planet. And it's at the core of the regenerative paradigm, and it's upstream of most of what's being discussed. There's a lot of contention around the sort of commodifying or the deleterious and or just fraudulent behaviors within nature markets and things like that. But there's just no shortcut to actually building meaningful relationships with organizations that are doing the original work, and making sure that the wind is in their sails. Um, Another way of describing this is to say that MRV is not just entirely like a scientific pattern or practice, and that MRV stands for measurements, results, and verification. So here I'm pointing at some of this verification thinking. Um, Verification of community ownership and governance, that ensuring that it's actually held and being engaged by local populations is incredibly important. And anchoring on chain consent, free, prior, and informed consent, or community consensus, is in some ways as important as NDVI indices and things like that. So claims run the world in one sense. And if we look at this kind of claim contract model, I could say claims and contracts run the world as a sort of evolution of that thought for this talk. But that in effect, reports, certifications, credits, and all of these things are aggregations around impact. And we should focus on the integrity of creating claims and less about what kind of instrument people want to create from them, because upstream of the name you use for a particular credit or unit or whatever is essentially an aggregation of claims, and we should be focused on the integrity of those claims and how they enfranchise the people doing the work as much as possible. So that's to say, in every way, the verification process should include local participation and ownership, because that's the way the movement really goes somewhere. It's verification with, not over. Most of the disagreement and resistance within the climate finance movement has been centered around the idea that it's not putting wind in the sails of local populations that have and are continuing to do environmental protection. So how do we create momentum and wind in the sails of these movements using the instruments of verification and validation? So those are just like four sort of prompts to sort of like land this broader idea. I think just to close, we're trying to create a system where we're inheriting these legacy institutions and and in a way using this emerging set of technology to compost but preserve the helpful parts of them, and in order for a new generation of institutions and organizations to emerge that are grounded. And this ground symbol from electrical engineering resonates with me. We're currently working in an economic paradigm that's ungrounded, and potentially some novel applications of blockchain in the legal and economic sectors can allow us to make more grounded institutions. So yeah, that's it. That's me. I'm Austin at Regen Foundation. I love talking about this stuff. I think about it all day. I appreciate the invitation to be here and the consideration of the watchers of the recording too. So reach out if you're interested. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Austin. That was a really fascinating presentation. Theoretically rich, I would say, a lot to unpack, and food for thought. So I know we don't have a lot of people with us today, but I did want to, if you're open to it, open up for any questions or comments and for some discussion. We don't have a whole lot of time, but maybe people do have questions. I know I
Sure.
have lots of questions I could ask, but I hold back.
Mm.
Yeah. Trin or James or Zhao or Stephen, anybody would like to ask some questions to Austin?
Yeah, I can go.
Sure,
Yeah,
Trin.
thank you, Austin. Listening to your talk is always very, very intense with learning. and food for thoughts. Talking about the claims and verifiable claims, a few days ago I talked to a person that interact a lot with verifiable credential, and he strongly believed that verifiable credentials shouldn't use blockchain technology at all. They don't have to. They can use with that, and he strongly argued for not combining with blockchain, but rather should use web technology in general. Do you have some experience or some opinion about that?
Well, I wouldn't say I have an opinion. I wouldn't say I have a ton of experience. I'm certainly experienced with like authentication of credentials and identity within Web3 systems and the benefits and the potential shortcomings of those. Kind of underlying a lot of what was just shared in the work that you and I have discussed, Trin, but it's relevant to the broader movement is this idea that blockchains enable like another addressing system to live on top of the current structure of addressing systems that we see, so that there's an endpoint within a network that can refer to me, or it could refer to an organization, or it could even refer to a non-human entity. And there's a potential to say, okay, well, we can prototype, or we can iterate through systems by which people are addressed as unique individuals, unique entities, and things like that. This project like formerly WorldCoin, is an example of that, where you have a unique address within a blockchain that is tied to biometric information, your retina scans and things like that. There's also this idea of like soul-bound tokens, where tokens are uniquely attributed to an individual that's like soul-bound. The inverse of that's really common is like a Sybil attack, which is to say one individual can create 500 addresses and pretend I'm 500 people. So if it's a kind of one person, like correlating individuals with discrete address points is like an incredibly profound and challenging question, because it's like, how do you really anchor that? But inevitably, we're going to be coming up into that question, because part of what's being discussed here is that we are using collectively held protocols to distribute trust in the state of a system amongst ourselves, rather than relying upon a central authority that has some kind of might or insight or power to maintain that. And I don't think it's one or the other. I think we're going to be used to being addressed and engaged by many different systems concurrently. So social security numbers are not going to go away. We should keep them, absolutely. But that we have a sort of like a better ability to like choose how we verify ourselves. And just as a side note, people getting like having a verifiable identity within blockchain and Web3 systems is a hassle, in part because you're absorbing the work that a authoritative structure, like an authority, a namespace authority would be providing you. Individuals absorb that, so they have a seed phrase or a ledger or a hardware wallet or something. But if you look at I think I spend probably about half of my day authenticating myself into different systems, where I'm like getting like an SMS code to my phone to make sure I can log into that email, which will allow me to log into my password manager. We're in a scenario where like your credentials or your identity is like incredibly complicated at this point, how to do it. And there seems to be zero ambiguity that we should not be relying upon platform capitalist institutions that are owning our data, like Facebook, Apple, or Google, to be the primary systems which authenticate who we are in digital space. So I would strongly petition for a sovereign distributed trust model around credentials. And if not, we are essentially arguing that that authority is being held by the wealthiest corporations possible, and part of the core work is to distribute that power into a distributed set of hands. But it's not like there's just one universal identity that's then allowed through a distributed ledger. You can have as many identities as there are ledgers, of which there are many blockchains exist. So it doesn't resolve the issue that there's just one single character, but it is like haunting, I think, to realize that who we are like through our banks and through logging into other like government websites and things like that is brokered through these like large data providers that are big data collectors. And so that I think unambiguously needs to change. That's a great question. Didn't really talk very much about that. We generally refer to that as like on-ramps within the work that I do. Like, how do you on-ramp into something? How do you identify yourself and participate?
Yeah. Big thanks, Austin. Great answer.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question for Austin, James, or Stephen, or Sal? No. I do. We're at the top of the hour. I do have a number of questions that are of a more theoretical nature.
Mhm.
And so respecting your time, I don't want to keep you, but I'd love to follow up with you about those theoretical questions that I have. As I'm researching. I do lots of different research into blockchains, but one of them is around peer consensus and the social formation of blockchain communities, ecosystems, and how peer consensus and determining what is in group and out group, a lot of the social constructs you would find. So just seeding you with some things that I might follow up with you about
Yeah.
would be in relation to those kinds of questions.
Mm.
So yeah, would love to do that. But for now, we'll just not keep you further. And thank you so much for a really interesting, um, insightful, and I think thought-provoking in many ways. There are lots of really interesting ideas in there, like addressability and claims and contracts. And we don't, I think, have enough of this kind of conversation when we're talking about blockchain. It tends to get very technical, and we lose sight of some of these ideas like institutions and commons and these larger constructs, which I think do shape very much how we design the technology, how it's implemented, and what it can achieve for us. So thank you for bringing those ideas to us today. And we look forward to having you again, and I'm going to follow up with you.
Sounds great.
Of course.
Thanks all.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Austin.
Austin, fantastic presentation.
Yeah,
Thank you. Bye.
much. Really appreciate it. Bye for now.
Take care.